Okay, so I'm recording. This is good. Hi everyone. I am Anne Scatolin, the Executive Director of the Sciences Po American Foundation. Welcome to this new European Affairs webinar series, the first for 2026. Today, we're welcoming two experts to talk about how global value chains connect industries, technologies, and infrastructure across continents, bringing efficiency but also vulnerabilities. Over the past years, supply chains, because this is the old word of value chains, or in my definition of the word, have become part of our everyday life. From the COVID-19 moment when toilet paper suddenly mattered a lot to today's constant headline on tariff, semiconductors, and Greenland. A little housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. We are going to start with a fireside chat. You can ask your question in the Q&A box. We're going to try to answer them as they come, but most likely at the end of the conversation. Our speakers now. Leslie Palti-Guzman is a seasoned energy market analyst, a strategic advisor, an entrepreneur, and a podcaster. She's recognized expert in global gas markets, commodity trading, liquefied natural gas infrastructure, energy policy, maritime trade, and geoeconomics. She is the founder of Energy Vista, a strategic advisory firm delivering foresight at the intersection of energy, shipping, and global affairs. She hosts the Energy Vista podcast, which I encourage everyone to subscribe to, and explores the geoeconomics of energy. She has testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and she frequently speaks on global forum on television. She's also a Sciences Po alumna. Isabelle Mejean is a professor of economics at Sciences Po since 2021. She's also a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy and Research, a scientific advisor to the Centre d'études et de prospective, non, Centre d'études prospective et d'information internationale, le CEPI, as well as a member of the Conseil d'analyse économique and a member of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Kiel Institute. Isabelle Mejean's research interests span international macroeconomics and international trade. She's interested in the structure of firm-to-firm trade networks and its consequences for various aggregate outcomes. She publishes regularly in the top peer-reviewed international journals. And aside from our speakers, I've asked Anthony Sirocco to join again. He was our last interviewer to lead this conversation. During the day, Anthony is the head of M&A North America at Commerzbank, and he's also a dear friend of Sciences Po and the Foundation, and has a keen interest in international relations. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. In this webinar, we will approach the topic from multiple angles. First, Isabelle will deepen our understanding of global value chains. Then Leslie will explain interconnections of industry, technology, and maritime security. Lastly, we will together explore cross-cutting themes and implications. So, first question is for Isabelle. When we talk about global value chains today, what do people most often underestimate about how interconnected and fragile they really are?
So I would say that maybe a feature that is most often not well known by people is the fact that when you look at the data, global value chains are actually not that global. A very large component of what we are producing now in these complicated production processes is organized at the mostly regional level. So basically, when we produce cars for the European markets, car makers are mostly sourcing components from other European firms. The same is true in the US, whereby production is mostly organized at the scale of the NAFTA. And this is true generally. So this very strong regional component is something that is a deep feature of the data. But despite this, we hear a lot about value chains being very little resilient to shocks, and including to shocks that are happening in very far away countries. And the reason why it is the case is that despite this very strong regional component, most firms in the world rely for some of their inputs on goods that are produced very far away, say in China or in other very remote countries. And the deep organization of this type of value chains implies that shocks that happen to even those tiny components of a car or whatever are going to spill over to the whole value chain. So one example, and then I'll stop my answer to this question, is what happened in 2011 after the Tohoku earthquake in Japan. And at the time, so of course, this was a disaster for a lot of different reasons, but it happened that in March 2011, Peugeot in France had to stop production in one of its plants. And the reason why that they were facing a shortage of a very tiny airflow sensor that was normally sourced from Hitachi in Japan, and this plant was in the Tohoku earthquake zone. And the shortage of this specific component had consequences well beyond the region of the earthquake, including in value chains that are very much European-based, like the car industry in Europe. So that, I think, is a good illustration of how even tiny components that are missing in very complex organizations, such as modern global value chains, can have very deep consequences.
Thank you. Leslie, could you also provide another real-world example, one that illustrates how a disruption in maritime logistics or energy flows can ripple across global systems?
Absolutely. And I'm going to build also a little bit on what Isabelle just mentioned. I see also a concrete example, actually, that happened in 2024 and in some parts continues until now, is that we've seen a disruption of two key passageways, sea lanes, transit routes. One is the Panama Canal, and the other one is the Suez Canal. And for much of global commerce, those two routes have interconnected the Americas and Europe Europe with Asia. So they have optimized time, freight costs, efficiency. However, in 2024, for the Panama Canal, because of drought, we've seen major bottleneck in this lane. And for the Red Sea Suez Canal, the Iran-backed Houthi group has basically forced the fleet of vessels to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. And so those two events that happen at the same time, more or less, have seen a decline of transit around those two vital shipping lanes and have forced a dramatic rerouting of global shipping. And that has also reconfigured trade flows in a more regional manner. So, for example, if you look at the exports of commodities from the US, oil and gas, especially LNG, it made more sense to send it to Europe because the Panama Canal towards Asia didn't make sense economically and logistically. And on the other hand, Qatar, for example, exported more to China because it didn't make sense for Qatari LNG to head to Europe because the route was adding 10 to 15 days. So this is a concrete example where we're seeing, huge logistical security threats really impacting global trade. And it also revealed something uncomfortable, the fact that it happened at a time where the US was growing as the largest oil and gas exporter, but it still depends on sea routes to export its commodities and sea routes that it doesn't fully control. And we've seen that the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea was really nobody was able to enforce freedom of navigation and fully restored the route. However, the actors that did some backdoor deals with the Houthi, like Russia or China or Iran, were able to use the route, while Western players that depend on Western insurance and Western ship operators had to reroute. So that was a kind of an interesting development too.
Excellent, thank you. Isabelle, in recent years, how have global value chains evolved, and what does this mean for economic resilience and risk exposure?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you call recent years, but usually I tend to discuss like two main periods for global value chains. The first one is between the 90s and the 2000, sorry, which is really the period of hyper globalization, whereby we see like overall world trade explode and to a level that had never been seen at any point in time. And this is precisely the period when those global value chains have really built in, have expanded quite a lot, and the number of production stages and their geographical distribution has evolved quite a lot. So this is really the period when those very complex value chains are really building and expanding quite a lot. When you look at the data on overall trade, but also the value-added content of trade, which is a standard measure of how much, how big or how strong the fragmentation of production processes, what you see is that this period has basically ended around the great financial crisis, so around 2007. And since then, the structure of trade is more or less stable. And it's been so even after COVID. So COVID was a period when there was a lot of disruption. We were lacking a lot of things, not only toilet paper, but also semiconductor. Containers were missing quite a lot. So this was a period in which there was a lot of like kind of issues to global value chains. But when you look at global statistics, we don't see consequences yet for the overall structure of trade. And so basically global value chains in, say, 2014 are kind of similar overall as what they were in 2008. So that's basically the situation that we see in the statistic. Now, of course, the last year has been quite of a game changer for a lot of things, and in particular, the functioning of global trade, because the institutional order, the functioning of trade within the multilateral system and the WTO rules has been challenged quite deeply. And this is very likely to have consequences in the future. So basically, we expect as kind of observers of international trade that in the future, maybe the structure of value chain is going to change a bit. And we expect a lot, even more regionalization in global value chains. But this is not something that we see in the data yet. And the reason is that building those value chains involves huge investment, and those investments are not adjusting on a day-to-day basis. So this takes time to build a value chain. This also takes time to reshore some of your production. And so concluding or taking a stock of what has happened over the last 2 to 5 years is going to take a bit more time when, in statistical terms.
One follow-up question, where do you see the biggest blind spots in how governments or firms map and manage their value chains?
So if I take the perspective of individual firms and how the functioning of their value chain is operating, the degree to which what the choices that they are doing is efficient in the sense of having a good balance between the efficiency gains from the organization of production at the worldwide level and the risks that is associated with this. The main issue that I think is a concern, including for policymakers, is really the question of the assessment of risk. And the reason is that at the firm level, firms have a fairly good understanding of their exposure to trade through their direct suppliers or through their direct customers. But in complicated value chains, such as the ones that we're discussing today, what matters is not only your direct exposure to potentially risky producers, but also the exposure of your suppliers, so indirect exposure. And so the risk along the whole value chain is potentially a risk that you might have to deal with. And so this is a very complicated question when you think about a single firm deciding on a strategy. This risk assessment is very often very imperfect, not because firms do not realize that some of their strategy is risky, but because measuring this risk is extremely difficult. So from a policy perspective, what this means is that there is a lot of value of building statistics and detailed statistics about potential choke points in those value chains. So firms might not realize that they're sourcing their semiconductors from some wholesaler in Europe, but this wholesaler, as well as most wholesalers in the world, are sourcing these semiconductors from a single firm in Taiwan, which is very much exposed to a lot of geopolitical risks. So now semiconductors are well known, but there are a lot of other choke points that I think maybe firms might be happy to learn about. For government, I think the main challenge that we see today is that for years we've been living in a world of a rules-based system organized around the rules of the WTO. And unfortunately, what we learned over the last few months is that this system is just dead, at least is not going to work for some times. And instead, a number of big trade partners, including China and the US, are willing to use economic coercion, so exploit trade dependencies for geopolitical purposes. And this needs to be integrated by government. And this is fairly urgent because this is the world in which we are going to live in the next few years.
Sure, absolutely. I'd like to shift our focus to security and technological aspects of value chains. Leslie, a question for you. Maritime infrastructure and shipping are seldom in the headlines, and yet they're essential. Why is this sector so central to both economic stability and security?
Yes, just before that, if I can bounce back on the economic coercion.
Please.
I still think that for the US, I mean, it's not a done deal yet. We don't know the end of the story and how it will eventually play out. And I'm very cautious about not over-interpreting or over-exaggerating. Because for some sectors, for some value chains, and I'm, watching very closely energy, I don't think the US has ever threatened to use its energy leverage to cut supply or to manipulate pricing or to withhold production and so on. So that just like we can come back to that. So for maritime, what's very interesting is that more than 80% of global trade, international goods, are transported on the water. So raw materials, manufactured products, energy, all transported by the sea. And what has really caught my attention last year and this year is that the US has only 80 internationally trading vessels under its flag, while China has more than 5,500. So huge imbalance, especially in specific segments where, as I mentioned earlier, liquefied natural gas. Europe is importing a lot of liquefied natural gas, notably from the US, more than 56% coming from the US as for last year. The US has only one LNG tanker under US flagged, US crew, US owned carrier. And so, the US has finally realized that it's a huge geoeconomic vulnerability because it was really competitive for a time to outsource shipbuilding to South Korea, to China, to Japan. But it came with a cost, which is the fact that the US is hardly building any more ships. So as of a year and a half ago, there has been a huge push in the US. It's a bipartisan approach to restart a value chain in the US. Not everything is going to be made in the US. Some of it will be in cooperation with allies like South Korea. But the idea is that the West has neglected the strategic importance of global merchant fleet, including commodity tankers, and has allowed China to dominate the infrastructure, the logistics, and the routes. Because what we have learned is that if you outsource, including shipbuilding, you lose also some knowledge and expertise for building military vessels. So you have here like some kind of synergies between the military and the merchant fleet usually. And if you lose the expertise on the merchant, you are losing also expertise and know-how on the military side. So I think that the different efforts that the US is implementing, there is the USTR investigation that is looking at how the China has dominated this value chain and is exerting dominance there. There is also a bipartisan bill. All of this is going to require a lot of strategic patience, money, and determination, because it's not going to happen overnight. And it doesn't make sense neither for the US to do everything on its own. But that's where, I think alliances and with partners, whether in Europe or in Asia, that have the know-how will be really useful.
Taking a step back, we see that digitalization and data have transformed logistics and energy flows. In your view, where does technology most clearly act as a force multiplier, and where does it introduce systemic risks?
So for a couple of years, I worked with companies in the geospatial intelligence field, so with data that are powered by satellite imagery technology. And for me, it's a very good example. So you have nowadays platforms that are enabling governments, traders, like all kind of different actors to monitor real-time flows of commodities or all kind of commodities, but specifically oil and gas. It has really we've made huge progress, not just in the technology, but also on the analysis of those data. So through visualization and being able to interpret what you see from those images, from those satellite images. And so you're able to detect any anomalies in trade, optimize trade routes. It gives a lot of transparency on real-time trade flows, but also to be able potentially to anticipate what's coming next and anticipate big market movements. But so with all this new transparency, we've discovered also that we have a view on all illegal trades and sanctioned vessels, for example, that are transporting oil and gas. And so you also create unintended consequences because some actors, bad actors, have started to turn off their AIS signals, which is the pulse that vessels emit when they are in the water. And most of the time it's to avoid collisions. So they tell you, hey, I'm here. Except that if you want to be undetected, you're going to turn off the signal because you know that people are watching you. But so it can create collisions, but it has also triggered more ship-to-ship transfer in high seas, which is more likely potentially we're going to see potentially more environmental incidents and leaks, especially if we're talking about oil. And we've seen a proliferation of sanctioned tanker fleets. So tankers that are old, not insured, and trying to evade any kind of sanctions and any kind of monitoring and tracking. So that has been kind of an unintended consequence and potential risk to trade.
Just curious, how do disruptions in one domain, whether cyber incidents or port congestion, cascade into broader economic or security impacts?
So actually, I have an example of physical harm, which has been over 2023 and 2025. We've seen several vessels dragging their anchors and have severely damaged undersea data cables, power cables, especially in the Baltic Sea. We have examples of a Russian tanker or Chinese ship, 2 Chinese ships actually, and this is a key example of hybrid warfare, or if you want to be nice, some kind of gross negligence, but I think we're more on the case of hybrid warfare. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've witnessed really a surge of these attacks on infrastructure, and it's kind of blurring the lines between military aggression, covert disruptions, commercial warfare. And so, NATO doesn't have per se, it took some time for NATO to put together kind of a strategy to fight this, but it's clear that now, it would be considered like a malicious activity, and even if it doesn't trigger right away some kind of it's not an act of war. I think that all the actors involved and that have been watching and monitoring closely there is more readiness in terms of potential military action. And in turn, that creates more risk for those kind of trade routes in the Baltics, around Scandinavia, around Denmark, for merchant vessels and commercial vessels. Things that they have to watch while they were not watching this before.
Thank you. Just to wrap up this section, a question for both of you. Are there particular nodes or linkages in global networks today that worry you most, whether energy, shipping, or firm networks?
On my side, I would say that maybe something that at least researchers have not been thinking too much about are digital services, which are markets where the level of concentration of activity is extremely high when you compare with almost any good market. And in which there are very high degrees of vulnerabilities. And again, these vulnerabilities might come from economic coercion or infrastructures. A lot of these digital services rely on infrastructure that themselves do not seem to display, or we don't exactly know what is the level of redundancy in those systems and these networks. And so I think a big concern that I would have, at least as a European citizen, is really the level of dependence that we in Europe have vis-à-vis the rest of the world for those digital services. And again, I'm thinking about payment system. So we all rely on Visa. So we don't have like redundancies in payment system, or not a lot of it. But I'm also thinking about a lot of business services that are almost all supplied by the same few firms at the worldwide level.
Thank you. Let's shift focus to some cross-cutting themes, starting with integration of economics and security. Isabelle, we often still separate economic policy from security policy. Why is that distinction harder to sustain in practice?
So, I mean, I'm going to answer from the point of view of someone studying trade policy as an economic tool for government to affect the allocation of resources across countries and across individuals within a country. So that's typically how we think about what is trade policy and how governments are using this policy for some economic purposes. But what we've seen, at least I think very clearly over the last few months, is that trade policy can also be used as a geopolitical tool to achieve some geopolitical objective. So I'm very often asked by French journalists for commenting about each announcement of the President of the United States regarding tariffs, and there is a question on the Q&A about tariffs, but so I'm asked a lot to talk about the rationality around this decision on trade policy. And this has forced me to think a lot more, a lot deeply about what is a good setting to think about this whole mess. And something that I found very useful is to think about this as potentially a way to give up on some economic gains from international trade, which we know are very important and that are going to be harmed by these tariffs, in exchange of some geopolitical benefits. So you're showing with this type of policies that you're a strong player in international discussions. And there is a possibility that this might have positive effect on the geopolitical side. So I think the recent US trade policy is a bit easier to understand when you link this with broader geopolitical purposes. But this is also something that has been clear from the Chinese, from a lot of Chinese policies in the recent years. So China has been using export controls on very key products for quite a bit of time. So now they've announced broader export controls on rare earths, but this is not something that is new. They've used this before. Recently, they've cut the access to the Chinese market to Lithuanian products as a reaction to some geopolitical tension. So we've seen quite repeatedly recently that international trade and international trade tools are no longer used to maximize economic and global welfare.
Thank you. Leslie, how should leaders think about resilience when efficiency and interdependence remain central to competitiveness?
So it's a very good question in the context of what we see right now in the interdependence between the US and Europe in terms of energy flow and specifically natural gas, liquefied natural gas. Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Europe was in a very worrying situation because of the removal of Russian gas and had to rely much more on US LNG. And as a result, we have a growing interdependency between the both markets, because on one side, Europe doesn't have many other options right now. Norway remains the largest gas exporter to Europe, but it's kind of maxed out. Same for Algeria and other sources of supply. So the US is the one that has a growing capacity of exports. And most of it right now, as I mentioned earlier, is heading to Europe. However, the US needs markets for all this gas, and Europe right now provides this huge center of demand. So that's why there is an interdependence. And for Europe that really wants to rebuild its competitiveness, it needs low-cost energy. And we've seen that since the war in Ukraine, the buzzwords have been really more about energy security than about green energy, and it has been more about competitiveness. And in a world where Europe may see the US as less reliable, which I don't think should be the case, but where Europe wants to diversify, this is great. The word of the game right now is diversification. So in a world where Europe needs to diversify, it needs to look at other sources of energy. There is kind of a rebirth of nuclear energy, but that takes time, and it depends on which country in Europe. There is going to be a growth of renewables. And in terms of additional gas exporters, there could be some additional supply here and there. But it's always good to have in mind this kind of diversification, and not just supply, but also trading routes and pricing exposure too.
Let's talk a bit more about technology. Leslie, digital tools allow unprecedented visibility across supply chains, but they also create new failure points. How should leaders think about managing this trade-off?
Yeah. So I was mentioning earlier about satellite imagery and AIS. So AIS is the acronym is the Automatic Identification System, and it broadcasts the vessel's identity, the position, the speed, and it's for mostly traffic management. So in 2018, 2020, market observers have noticed that China there were huge anomalies with AIS signals around the ports and the coastal waters of China. And that was interpreted as potential manipulation of AIS by China, potentially for different reasons, masking trade activities, also potentially masking military activities. But so the market was used to a certain level of transparency because AIS signals give elements of data around port logistics. It's used by energy traders, by insurers, charters. It gives data about just-in-time supply chains, like a lot of awareness. So suddenly, when you had kind of a black box around China, it created some kind of worrying signals. And so, we are getting used to increasingly transparency and data. And the day the data is not yet, it's not there and is missing, that creates potentially vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Isabelle, from an economic perspective, what are the limits of data or modeling in anticipating how shocks propagate through complex value networks?
So first, we don't really try to anticipate. So what we're doing is mostly to build from historical data and try understand the functioning or the speed of transmission of different type of shocks. But what I would say is that, so first of all, these type of topics are very new. This is really something that we were not really studying much, say, before COVID, I would say. And despite the fact that a lot of people have started thinking about these questions, and despite the fact that we do have quite a bit of data on international trade flows, there are a lot of things that we don't understand yet. And I think one important thing that we don't understand is really the type of cost-benefit elements that are going to surround say, diversification of global value chains. So basically what we know from existing data is that global value chains are very poorly diversified. So when you look at very detailed firm data, what you see is that the vast majority of firms are going to have just one supplier for each of, or for most of their inputs. And so what that means is that in the wording of network analysis, there's not much redundancies in global value chains. And so the fact that there is not much redundancies by kind of revealed preference shows that building these redundancies is going to be costly for firms, and that's the reason why they don't do this in the first place. But going beyond this kind of qualitative statement is very difficult. We don't know how big the investments are for building these redundancies. And the second thing that we have very little information about, or very little sense of, is how costly it is to be lacking an input when you're a firm integrated into one of these complex global value chains. And in particular, one key kind of parameter that we are missing a lot in our model is about the degree to which you can substitute either you can substitute ex post. So basically, I'm a firm, I'm short in sensor, the component I was mentioning before. How much time does it take me to just find a different supplier for this good? And this we don't know a lot about. There are a lot of beliefs about this. So for instance, going back to the question of gas that Leslie has been mentioning a lot and that she's very knowledgeable about compared to me. I remember in March 2022, so just after the invasion of Ukraine, there was a colleague of mine that published a kind of policy paper trying to quantify the potential cost of Europe banning imports of gas from Russia. And so in their model, that was obviously very theoretical, they were estimating a cost that was kind of very close to zero, so not so big. And so they were arguing in favor of using this type of sanctions to kind of try influence Russia. And suddenly there was like huge fight among economists, but also between economists and policymakers about how costly it is, or it would be for Europe to cut imports of gas from Russia. And estimates that were floating around were really like going from 0 to 5% of the EU GDP. 4 years later, what we see is that there's almost no longer any imports of gas from Russia. And indeed, Europe has diversified away from Russia, mostly towards the US. So this was costly, but this was doable. And the question that is really key in these debates is how costly and how much time does it take to build this type of natural gas terminals and stuff like this, and how representative is the example of gas compared to other type of markets. So this is really a huge question mark that I'm not sure we are going to answer in the coming years, because this is a very difficult question.
Thank you. Leslie, what does effective public-private collaboration actually look like when it comes to enhancing resilience?
So let me take again the example of rebuilding US ships at home in the US, US-made shipbuilding. That would require intense public-private partnerships. And the US has started a collaboration, for example, with South Korea Hanwha, which has some affiliates in the US, US-owned companies, including the US Philly shipyard. And they have agreed to build together the first few tankers that will kind of kickstart this new value chain. Most likely, the first ones will build most of the components and the parts in South Korea, and then final assembly and some kind of hybrid, what is made in Korea versus what's made in the US, kind of ship making. But the intent is to restart the value chain and shared expertise, and also shared technology. And so you have not only an alliance between the US and South Korea, potentially between European companies like GTT in France, which has some kind of membrane technology that can be useful also for some tankers in the US. Like, you will need the know-how and the expertise from some companies. And South Korea has seen it as an opportunity also in the trade discussions between the US and Korea, and kind of enlarge the portfolio of what is being negotiated around the tariffs, and how Korea can help also the US where the help is needed. And I think, we are talking a lot about this new world order. The US is really right now valuing capable partners. So in terms of partnership, what can you bring to the table? South Korea has many big, large conglomerates, and some of them can bring things to the table.
Excellent. Isabelle, you mentioned that we received a question from the audience, from William Scott. What is the influence of US tariffs on global value chains? Would you like to add to your initial response earlier?
Yeah, I think it's a key question, and one that has been studied recently quite a lot using new data that the trade wars are offering. So basically, the kind of theory question is that tariffs are really a bad idea in global value chains, because tariffs are put on the value of imported goods. But the problem is that in value chains, by definition, goods are exported over and over, and each time you add a little bit of value added. And so what this means is that if there are tariffs along the way, those tariffs are going to add and to multiply, and their impact on the overall price is going to be quite important. So the consequence of this is that tariffs applied to goods that are entering value chains can very easily backfire. And this is basically the reason why exemptions are often put on goods that are entering very upstream in value chains, or goods that are highly traded within global value chains. So one key example when it comes to the US-EU situation is the aerospace industry. The aerospace industry is very much organized around the US and the EU. And so there are a lot of back and forth of components of planes that are floating or flying from one country to the next, and then back. And so it happens that the aerospace industry has been exempted from most of the Trump tariffs. Again, this is a good idea because in this industry, this would most certainly backfire when you impose tariffs on the component of the planes that are going to then be incorporated into your production. You're just harming your own competitiveness.
Thank you. Going to see if there are any more questions from the audience. Otherwise, I'll raise one of my own. In recent news, we see there is the announcement of a free trade agreement between the European Union and India. And it would be great to hear your preliminary reaction to the impact of this announcement on value chains in Europe, or for that matter, strategic industry security, especially in light of Trump's efforts to pressure India, while, of course, Europe is taking a different approach.
Yeah, so in general, we think of global value chains as being systems that very much need some form of certainty. So a very stable environment, and in particular, a very stable international environment. So WTO rules offer this type of stability. You know exactly how much you're going to be taxed at entry into a given country. And so you can organize your production using or counting on this cost in a very kind of certain way. So now again, these rules are no longer applied universally, or at least among all members of the WTO. And so the alternative to this is to pass regional trade agreement. So the EU has been doing this forever, and actually the deal that has just been signed was negotiated for, I think, almost 20 years. But basically, what we expect or what we think is that the EU and other countries might be accelerating on this type of trade agreements, because this is what is going to offer firms some form of stability that they need to do the investments that are needed to develop their value chain.
Excellent. Leslie, do you have preliminary thoughts regarding this recent announcement?
I mean, I see it in the context of Europe trying to find new trade partners that are not the US and not China, and thinking about in this of hedging, some kind of hedging and non-alignment. So I see it as I think it could be beneficial to bring stability and predictability for commerce.
Excellent. As we wrap up, it would be great to hear your expectations for the next year or the medium term with respect to policy making in Brussels versus Washington on the topic of value chains from a public policy perspective, and of course, private sector reaction.
Sorry, Leslie, do you want to go? I mean, I was looking at the questions on the Q&A, so I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the question. I'm sorry.
Well, no worries. In fact, we can disregard my question.
I can start with Washington. I think we shouldn't underestimate the direction that Washington is taking in terms of rebuilding some value chains at home and really encouraging made in America, and basically removing some huge vulnerabilities that some value chains have created for the US, whether it's minerals, critical minerals, or shipbuilding, shipping, as I was mentioning earlier. I think the direction of travel is there. It's bipartisan, which means that whoever is the president next, this direction will continue, and there is a huge support for this. So it's, as everything, it takes time. Bills don't always pass. But I think from the private and the government perspective, there is a huge enthusiasm to rebuild those value chains, and that will create economic growth at home, new jobs. Like some mining are reopening or starting in the US. I mentioned shipyards. That will take time, but eventually I think that will happen.
Isabelle, thank you for pointing out the additional questions submitted. Perhaps in the remaining time, we can go through them quickly. So George Bulow raises a few questions. He mentions it's apparent the US has decided in the short term, intermediate term, to become the lowest cost source of feedstock petrochemicals. This is leading many large producers to relocate major processing plants along the Gulf Coast, elsewhere in North America. What are the implications for supply chain changes?
I mean, I'm not the expert on the topic here, so what I'm going to say is really like from a mostly theoretical point of view. Policies do affect the geography of global value chains. So indeed, when you have some very strong kind of interest or some clear willingness of country like the US in reshoring or expanding its comparative advantage in some product markets, like here the petrochemical industry. This has consequences on reshoring, so this will happen. We've seen this in China with the Made in China 2025. There was a big push in industrial policy, and now we are seeing the consequence in terms of the flow of goods that are exported to the US or even more to Europe. So clearly, public policies do affect the geography of global value chains.
And I think, what Isabelle mentioned, competitive advantage is key here. I think the US is very a non-reluctant energy superpower right now, and will use all its energies, including all the ones that come from fossil fuels, and notably from the shale gas revolution, to produce low-cost energy, including for industry utilization, power generation. In the US, everybody's talking about the need to feed data centers and the growing electricity needs. So, this energy will really power the economy at home, and there will be also some for exports.
We have one last question from Alvarado Sanchez. How is Europe approaching the massive inbound of Chinese goods following US tariffs imposed on Chinese goods? Is it doing enough? Or is it working, or what isn't?
At that point, I don't know exactly what Europe is doing. Currently, I would say that the main kind of tool is surveillance mechanism. So this is a very big concern that we have here in Europe, that because of China losing access to the US markets, we are going to receive a flow and floods of Chinese products in Europe that might kind of disrupt or involve very strong competitive pressures on European producers. It happens that I just worked on the topic for a CEPR report, and what we've seen in the case of the first Trump trade war, so after 2018, 2019, we do see a very strong redistribution of trade towards Europe. So basically a third of what was no longer exported to the US was kind of sent to Europe. And of course, this is not small because the US market is big, and so we are talking about a lot of products. The same thing using the most recent data for now does not show a huge kind of flow of Chinese products coming in, but this is also because the period is very messy. We don't exactly know what will be the tariffs at the end. The only product market in which we already see big consequences is on the de minimis product. So the increase in the tax on de minimis product in the US after, I think it was like in May, on May the 2nd, has induced a big shift. So it has increased by a lot the cost of these products for US consumers. And here we see in the data a strong decrease in exports to the US and a huge increase of European imports on these very specific topics, product. So what is Europe doing? For now, we are mostly worrying. And then there are surveillance mechanism. But what the European Commission has said repeatedly is that they are ready to use anti-dumping instrument to kind of reduce the flow. So now the question is whether they are going to do this in the general context in which using trade policy defense instrument has a lot of political consequences.
Excellent. Isabelle, Leslie, thank you both for sharing your insights on this very important topic. Our next webinar will be about sports diplomacy in light of the exceptional convergence of mega events in the United States, offering a platform to compare European and American models of sports governance and diplomacy, including the central role of private actors. Hopefully you can join us then. And thanks all for participating.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.